Okay guys, Timmy coming at you here, and today what I want to do is I want to go over skeletal muscle. Alright, just a couple of things real basic. First of all, you're probably wondering now where they got these names for these muscles, and just so you know, I wondered that too. But let me give you an idea. First of all, many of the skeletal muscles are based on their shape. So, watch. The deltoid, right? That's the Greek letter D. So, anything with oid after it means resembles. So, the deltoid resembles delta. Nice. It's also based on the point of attachment from the bones, right? So a good example would be the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So it's connected to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid bone of the skull. And always remember that the first muscle that's named in a muscle is the origin of the muscle. More on that later. It's also based on the location in the body. So watch. This area of the body is the femur. So this is the rectus femoris. Now, rectus means straight up and down, right? Rectus abdominis, straight up and down. Rectus femoris, straight up and down. And then it's also based on what the muscle does. So if it is an extensor or a flexor, right? And it's also many times the muscle is named based on its relationship to other muscles in the area. So here we go. The extensor digitorum longus. It tells you what it does. Digit, the toes, right? Extensor, it extends the toes, and it's one of the longer bones in the lower leg, like gastrocnemius. Gastro is stomach or belly, and nemius is Greek for leg. So the gastrocnemius muscle makes up the bulk of the leg. Then you have the soleus. That's Greek for thin sandal. So as you can see, it's kind of a thin muscle there. So, what's important to know about the names? They can be based on their shape, based on their location of the body, based on their points of attachment, and based on what the muscle does, and then based how it's arranged in the body. Let me give an example of that. Like if you look at the external oblique muscle, right? The external oblique means at an angle. External means obviously outside. The vastus medialis, right? The vastus medialis closer to the midline. Vastus lateralis, farther away from the midline. So that's how muscles are named. Now, a couple of things about skeletal muscle and their basic function. Obviously, you need that to maintain posture and body position, right? If somebody's muscles don't contract, they're on rubber leg street. It's going to allow us for movement, and it supports soft tissue, right? So your rectus abdominis muscles protect your abdominal cavity and the stuff that's inside it. So if you get a umbilical hernia, for example, basically what has happened is your intestines have ruptured through that muscular wall. And because those muscles contract, if that intestinal wall, or the intestine gets pushed out through that little hole in the muscle, when the muscle contracts, it can actually cut off blood supply to that part of the intestine, and that's called a strangulated hernia, and those are bad for you. You don't want that. You want to go to gateway. And it guards entrances and exits of the body to the environment, right? Your orbicularis oris, right? You can close your mouth so, mosquitoes don't get in there. And then it also helps maintain core body temperature by producing heat. Remember, contracting muscles produce heat. Now, you need to know this. The most important element in muscular contraction, I've gone over this a gazillion times. Most important element in muscular contraction is calcium. Right? And this is also important. Skeletal muscle relies on calcium stored inside it. Stored inside the muscle cell, right? I explained to you before that the heart and blood vessels rely on calcium from the blood to contract. So calcium channel blockers do not affect skeletal muscle, right? Wouldn't make sense. So if calcium channel blockers affected the calcium in your skeletal muscle, then if you were placed on a calcium channel blocker, you couldn't move, but you would have good blood pressure. So you'd be paralyzed, but your blood pressure's good. Yeah, that drug would be a big seller. All right? So those are the functions of muscle, just real quick. Now, when you talk about origin and insertion of muscle, this is pretty basic. Now watch. The origin is the bone that the muscle's attached to that doesn't move. The insertion is the bone that moves when the muscle contracts. So as you can see right here, right, you have the bicep, and it's connected to the radius. And then it's also connected to the scapula and to the shoulder socket itself. So when you contract your bicep, your scapula doesn't move. Your radius moves. The lower part of your arm moves. So the insertion of a muscle is the part of the muscle that causes that bone to move. And the origin is where the muscle's connected to the bone, but that bone does not move. Okay, a couple of things about skeletal muscle you gotta know. Number one, skeletal muscle requires a nerve to stimulate it in order to contract. So if you have a spinal cord injury, damage below the spinal cord injury, right, below that spinal cord injury, that person is not going to be able to contract the muscles below that injury. That's why you can't be paralyzed from the waist up, right? So damage to a spinal cord, wherever that damage is, because it's under conscious control, skeletal muscle, if the damage is here, then any skeletal muscle below this injury, you're not going to be able to move. That's how doctors can conclude, based on where the damage is, what type of paralysis that's going to happen. So typically, below T1, thoracic vertebrae number 1, if you have damage at that point or above, then you will be a quadriplegic. So remember that. It's very important that you understand that skeletal muscle requires a nerve in order to make it contract. And it's under conscious control, right? You can decide to lift your arm up, wave, flip me off, whatever. And it's under the control of the somatic nervous system. That's part of the peripheral nervous system. Remember, the peripheral nervous system is made up of 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Remember this? And there are two divisions to the peripheral nervous system. There's the somatic, which controls skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic, And again, autonomic implies automatic. So because it's under conscious control, it's got to get signals from the brain in order to make that muscle contract. And the nerve that stimulates skeletal muscle to contract is called a motor nerve. And motor nerves are myelinated. They got that fatty insulation around them that speeds electrical impulse, right? You don't want to have to wait around to stimulate muscles to run away from, the Hamburglar. So those are important concepts. Now, the concept of a motor unit, right? A motor unit is the motor nerve and the muscle fibers it innervates. So you have large motor nerves. One nerve innervates a lot of muscle, and that's involved in gross movement, right? Walking. If you saw me dancing, that would be gross movement. Get it? And then you have small motor units, and small motor units are that one nerve stimulates or innervates a small number of muscle fibers, and that's involved in fine motor skills, right? Writing, playing the piano, swinging a golf club. Again, swinging my golf club could be defined as gross motor movement, but I digress. All right, what I want to do now is I want to get into some of the anatomy of skeletal muscle, all right? And skeletal muscle, by its nature, is fractile. Basically, what you do is you take a bunch of small little muscle fibers and you just group them together. And as you group them together, you're going to make a bigger and bigger muscle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you from the outside of the muscle to the inside, and then I'm going to really get into where the rubber meets the road and how a muscle actually contracts. It's not going to be detailed. It's going to be very rudimentary. This is general anatomy and physiology. All right, so here we go. Now, first of all, in order for a muscle to do anything to help you move, that muscle has to be attached to a bone. So, what connects muscle to bone are tendons. So tendons are thick connective tissue that connect muscle to bone. And where they attach, the bone actually thickens. And that's called a process. So when you apply stress to a bone, that bone will actually thicken. That's why, as people get older, they tend not to move as much, and especially with women, because they're not contracting their muscles a lot, that bone tends to get thin. The other thing is that putting stress on bone actually causes bone to grow, right, to become stronger, because the body does stuff that makes sense. So if this guy's going out and he's lifting up cars all day, then the body's going to say, look, I got to make my muscles and my bones stronger because this is stressful to me and I don't like that. So the covering of a large skeletal muscle, the whole skeletal muscle, is called the epimysium. And the epimysium is, think of it as like a thick saran wrap that goes around the whole belly of the muscle. And this epimysium does not contract. The muscle actually contracts within the epimysium. So the epimysium basically prevents friction from building up around the surrounding tissue. It doesn't contract. The muscle itself contracts within that epimysium. Now, as you can see, you have a group of muscle cells. And these groups of muscle cells are then wrapped in another saran wrap, and that's called the paramecium. So the paramecium takes small groups of muscle cells and then wraps them together. Then you have the individual muscle cell itself. And that individual muscle cell is wrapped in what's called the endomysium. So again, you can see the fractal nature of it. So the endomysium is like a saran wrap that wraps individual muscle cells together. So think about it. I don't know. What would you wrap? I don't know, maybe egg rolls, right? So think of the egg roll wrapping itself as the endomysium. Then you put a bunch of egg rolls in a small hefty bag. That would be the paramecium. Then you take a bunch of those small little hefty bags filled with egg rolls and you put them in a big bag. That's the epimecium. All right. Now, what I want to talk to you about is the muscle fiber itself, right? And the muscle fiber itself is where the contraction actually occurs. Now, the muscle fiber or muscle cell, same thing, right, is called a sarcomere. And within that sarcomere, you have the contractile elements. And this is where I want to spend a little time. This is where the rubber meets the road. So the sarcomere, right, is made up of a bunch of these contractile elements. And the two most important contractile elements in muscular contraction are actin and myosin. Now, I don't care about thin or thick filaments, right? That clinically, who cares, right? But what I want to be able to explain to you is how at a basic level the skeletal muscle contracts, all right? So we're looking at the core of muscle contraction. Now, here we go. Now remember, in order for a muscle to contract, skeletal muscle, it has to be stimulated by a motor nerve. And the place where a motor nerve, this is a motor nerve, and the muscle cell, or sarcoleum is the muscle cell membrane, where they meet is called the neuromuscular junction. Now remember, when we talked about the nervous system, that nerves and other nerves don't directly touch, and nerves that stimulate cells don't directly touch. They form a synapse. And in order for this motor nerve to stimulate the skeletal muscle to contract, it has to release a neurotransmitter, that protein we talked about in the nervous system. And the neurotransmitter for skeletal muscle contraction is always acetylcholine, always. Always. What's the neurotransmitter for skeletal muscle contraction? Always acetylcholine. Now, when acetylcholine is released from this motor nerve, it's going to bind to, you're not going to believe this, but acetylcholine receptors on the muscle cell membrane. Now this is important. Skeletal muscle cannot produce its own electrical impulse, but if it's stimulated by acetylcholine, it can then spread the electrical impulse all over the muscle cell membrane. So let's get into a little bit of the actual contraction of skeletal muscle. So what I want to do first is I want to explain to you first of all where you're at. So this right here is the axon of a motor nerve. And these little red balls here, those things contain acetylcholine. Alright, and this area right here, what you're looking at is the neuromuscular junction. And again, this axon doesn't touch it directly, but how it communicates with it is by releasing that neurotransmitter. So let's say that you want to contract this muscle. Who cares what muscle it is? Let's say your leg muscle, right? You want to get up and walk around. That motor nerve is going to be stimulated. It's going to create an electrical impulse, and it's going to travel over the end of the axon of that motor nerve. And when that does that, that's going to cause the release of acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is going to be released through the process of exocytosis. And acetylcholine then is going to bind. It's going to bind to these acetylcholine receptors on the muscle cell membrane. Now, what I want you to know is once the acetylcholine is bound to that acetylcholine receptor on the muscle cell membrane, it's going to create an electrical impulse that travels over and around the muscle cell membrane. There it goes, lighting up. Look at that. When you contract muscles, just sparkle. All right. What's the most important element in muscular contraction? It's calcium. Now, this is important. In skeletal muscle, the calcium is stored inside the skeletal muscle in an area called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum. Don't that sound like a monster? Like Godzilla versus Sarcoplasmic reticulum? Anyways, watch. We learned, and you better know this, the most important element in muscular contraction is calcium. Where does skeletal muscle get its calcium from? From the stored calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So these little red balls represent calcium. The only way that calcium is going to be released is if that muscle is stimulated by a motor nerve. Then the electrical impulse is going to travel over the muscle cell fiber, and it's going to open voltage-gated calcium channels. Remember this? On the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And when those voltage-gated channels open due to the electrical impulse traveling over the muscle cell, calcium is going to move from high concentration in the sarcoplasmic reticulum to low concentration in the actin and myosin filaments. So here comes the calcium. Here it comes. Flooding out. There it goes. Okay. I want to stop this right there. Wait. Okay, good. Let me go back just a bit. Alright. What you're looking at is the two contractile proteins. This whole protein right here is called actin. And this whole protein right here with the little blue chicken legs hanging off of it, this is called, gee whiz, called myosin. And in order for a muscle to contract, what you have to do is you somehow have to connect the blue chicken leg to the partially chewed beer nuts on actin. All right? And calcium allows that to be possible. Now, if we look, calcium floods in from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Go back just a second. All right, calcium's flooding in. Now, if you notice, the blue chicken legs are not connected to the partially chewed beer nuts, right? So the blue chicken leg, the myosin head, is not connected to the actin molecule. Now, when calcium floods in, as you can see, there's this little blue licorice whip. That little blue licorice whip is called tropomyosin. And tropomyosin is a protein that's covering the actin molecule. So this little partially chewed beer nut is the actin molecule. And in order for the myosin head, the blue chicken leg, to bind to the actin molecule, the only way it can do that is by getting the tropomyosin molecule out of the way. As long as this tropomyosin molecule is blocking the binding site on actin for that myosin head, that muscle won't contract. So sitting on the tropomyosin, what appears to be partially chewed banana bubblicious bubblegum is a group of proteins called the troponin complex. Now I'm going to be very general here. Now watch. In order for the cross bridge, the myosin head, to bind to the actin molecule, you got to get the tropomyosin molecule out of the way. How do you do that? Well, you got calcium here. And what does calcium do? Well, I'm going to explain it to you. Ready? Here we go. All right. So what do we got so far? We got calcium released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it floods into the actin and myosin filaments. As long as the tropomyosin molecule covers the binding sites on actin, the myosin head can't bind to the actin. But you got calcium flooding in. And when calcium floods into the actin and myosin, calcium binds to troponin. So watch what happens. Boom. And when calcium binds, the tropomyosin that was blocking those binding sites on actin twists out of the way. And when it twists, it now opens up these binding sites on actin for the myosin head. And there's a natural attraction between the myosin head and that actin molecule. Right? Now, watch. What do you need to contract muscles besides calcium? Well, you need ATP, right? So watch. Calcium got bound to the troponin complex. It caused the tropomyosin to twist out of the way. And then, as you can see, the myosin head now binds to the actin. This is the important. We spent like 10 years talking about ATP, right? Now you're going to find out where you actually use it. There's a molecule of ATP sitting on that myosin head. And when that myosin head binds to the actin molecule, it's going to cause that ATP to get broken down to ADP plus energy and heat, right? And that energy is going to be used to swing the myosin head that's now connected to the actin molecule. It's going to cause that myosin head to swing, swivel, and it's going to pull the actin molecule along with it because that myosin head's now connected to the actin molecule. So observe. Boom. What happened? Calcium bound to the troponin complex. It causes the tropomyosin to twist out of the way. Now the binding sites on actin for the myosin head are revealed, and the myosin head's going to bind to the actin. What sits on the myosin head? ATP. And when the myosin head binds to the actin, ATP is broken down to ADP, and that's going to cause the myosin head to swivel because of the energy that's released, and it's now bound to that actin molecule. And listen up, because this is true. When you pull an actin, you're contracting. I know. Look. It's almost over. That is skeletal muscle contraction. Now watch. The more calcium that's released, the more calcium that can bind to that troponin complex, and the more connections you can make between actin and myosin. And the greater the number of connections you make to actin and myosin, the stronger the force of contraction. And if you recall, right, I explained to you, and I'm taking a little poetic license here. In a normal muscle, you've got myosin, then you got the little myosin heads, right? And then you got the actin molecule, right? And you're going to have some, myosin heads here. You're going to have some myosin heads here, but no actin. And then you're going to have some actin here, but no myosin heads. So if you stretch the muscle, what you're going to do is you're going to line up the actin and myosin better. And when you line them up better, they're able to make more connections between each other. And the more connections you make between actin and myosin, the greater the force of contraction. So Starling's law applies to skeletal muscle as well, right? So that's a bit on skeletal muscle, its basic composition, and then how skeletal muscle contracts.